So in this video, we're going to be using Microsoft Excel to assess our data. We're going to be taking a look at the data that we just cleaned to better understand the data that we have and the approach that we can use in our analysis. So unlike the data wrangling where we had a plan of what we're going to be doing, in the assessment, we're really, the investigation unfolds before us. We're going to discover some new insights, and that's going to lead to more questions. So we really are not planning out the assessment ahead of time. We're just starting to discover the data and continue to explore it until we have a better understanding. So we're going to be doing a series of descriptive statistics to get some idea of the ranges and the means and the maximum and minimums of some of our values. And we're also going to be doing several different plots so that we can visually represent the data so that we really can gain some great insight into the data that we have, and that allows us then to figure out how we're going to go about to do our analysis on the data. So what you see here are the results of my assessment of the data. So I want to walk through this to show you how I arrived at a better understanding of my data. So I began by identifying each of the elements in my data. So these are the different fields that I have. And then I provided a description of each so that I can better understand, better communicate what each of these fields represent. And then I identified the data type, whether they were numeric or categorical. I identified them as nominal, ordinal, or interval, and so that I understand the type of data that I'm going to be working with. And then for those that made sense, those are the interval and the ordinal data elements, I identified the minimum, maximum, and the range. And some of these, it really didn't make sense to calculate the mean or the standard deviation or the median. So I left those blank. But if you can see here from identifying the min, I just used the min function in Excel to calculate that. And conversely, to identify the max value, I used the max function in Excel. And then the range, that was identified just by looking at the min and max. And then also you can see here the median function. Excel supports that, as well as the average function, which is the mean. Excel supports that as well. So this is the kind of the minimal calculations that I did just to get a feel for the range of the data and kind of the central point. And it's interesting when I take a look at the response choice. This is ordinal data. Oh, that's another thing I want to point out here too, is that the responses were a Likert response. So that seems like that should be a numeric data type, but it really is a categorical data type because it's not a definitive relationship between either 1 or 2 is always twice as much as 1, but rather 2 is a separate category than 1. So while these are numeric values, they really represent categorical ordinal data. So I still did some descriptive statistics on this just to better understand kind of the ranges, but I wouldn't, in my analysis, I'm not going to treat this as it were a numeric data type. But I did note that I had a mean of 4.2, so that means the responses are heavily weighted towards the upper end of strongly agree. And I can see this with my median value being a 5. So it is interesting, kind of the distribution of the data. And when I take a look at this on a bar chart, I'll better understand that distribution. Then next what I did is in yellow, I'm highlighting all the different elements of my data that I want to take a closer look at, that I'm going to conduct a frequency distribution to take a look at how the results varied in my data set. And so next, what I did is I then began for each of those fields that are highlighted in yellow, I conducted a frequency distribution for each of those. So for here, taking a look at the term value, I identified all the terms that are in my data set. And then for each of the terms, I did a count if. I used the count if function to count the number of instances that term was identified in my data tab. So I did that for each of these terms. I have a separate count if function. So then together, highlighting those two is how I created I used the chart wizard in Excel to create my frequency distribution chart that you see here. And so you can see that that the fall semester I get the most responses, spring semester I get the second most, and then summer it tails off. Not as many students are participating in classes in the summer, and so the number of results are less. And that's kind of what I would have expected anyway. So this takes a look at the number of responses across each of the terms over the period of time in which I have data. So I can see I have data from the fall of 2013 actually through the spring or through the fall of 2018. So that's my data range, and you can see the frequency of the number of responses that I have for each of those semesters. Next, I took a look at the question ID. So I did a frequency distribution of all the question IDs that I have here, and there's quite a few of them. So then what I did is I took a look at how often those questions were responded to. And you can see that there are quite a few that have a lot of responses and several that have less than 500 responses. So what that tells me is that not all these questions are being used all the time, that there's a certain subset, and I would say that this subset right here, those are the questions that were more long-term questions or that have replaced these other questions. So if I'm going to do my analysis, I can't do my analysis over all questions because I want to make sure that I'm using questions that are continually being asked in this survey. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just take a look at these results. So if I look at only those questions that have over 1,000 responses, then I'm going to be sure that I get these right here. So when I take a look at my frequency distributions, I can see that there's a certain subset of these question IDs that have over 1,000 responses. So these are the questions that are going to be within the scope of my analysis. So those that are going to be outside of the scope, I indicated those in gray just to indicate that those really are going to be the question IDs that I'm going to ignore in my analysis. All right, so the next, what I did is I took a look at the different categories of questions, and I found that this is not all that useful, but it's good to see that there are 3 different types of question categories regarding the course, faculty questions, and instructor questions. And the faculty questions, looks like that was a very rare instance, maybe an exceptional instance. So those certainly wouldn't be included in the scope of the analysis. Most of the questions are going to be based on the course or the instructor. And you can see the distribution of those. Next, I took a look at the question type. Again, for each of these, I'm using that COUNTIF to get my frequency count. I see that there's different types of questions, and these are the different types of questions that I found. And that open-ended looks like that same number 15 that we saw here is also indicated as well here. So I'm really gaining a lot of insight from these frequency distributions to better understand the data that I have, and it's going to help me in my analysis. So next I took a look at the campus, and we are going to be looking at either the main campus, which is our Duluth campus, or the online campus. And here we're seeing a significant number or a larger population of online responses than responses from the main campus. And then taking a look at my responses. And this is what I find very interesting is, first of all, that there were a couple questions that were really outside the Likert scale, but there are only a couple responses to those, where majority of our questions are going to be Likert responses, but they are all heavily weighted towards the strongly agree. So most of our students are responding positively to these questions, which it makes sense because that's certainly kind of our goal, is to have favorable response. And it's also, we're going to get that result because those faculty that aren't getting favorable response, they're working at improving to gear towards a more favorable response. So I would expect this type of distribution. I'm pleased that that strongly agree is so strong. And then next, taking a look at all the different questions. So these are each of the questions that we have. Here's the ID and the question text. And then looking through here, what I wanted to do is I wanted to look at the question that best indicates a successful outcome from that course. And that's what I'm looking at here is question 112. I learned the subject matter of the course. So this question to me indicates that the student felt that they were successful in the course, in that they learned the subject matter. So what I'm going to do, when I do my analysis, I'm going to take a look at this as kind of the goal. and I want to look at try to find attributes that will help us to indicate a higher success rate on question 112. So that's kind of an important thing to note. So when I went through this analysis, this was not a planned analysis. So unlike the data wrangling, where we have a plan and we're going to execute that plan, the analysis is much more look at the data, and that's going to require additional questions to investigate. So when I started with just looking at this data, I identified some of the data elements that I really wanted to be able to visualize in a frequency table. And then by looking at like question ID, I discovered that not all the questions are going to be within the scope of the study. And I found that as well as when I was looking at these other type of questions. Faculty questions are not going to be included within the scope of the study. So as I analyzed the data, I better understood what I was working with and how I'm going to focus my analysis and how I'm going to be able to filter out the results so that I can specifically look at my analysis, or be able to specifically look at the data that's going to help me lead to a successful analysis. And this is also how I'm identifying the kind of the question that is going to be the central focus of this analysis. So as I said, it's not a planned out analysis or assessment of the data. It's really kind of, you begin at one point and that's going to raise questions, and then you investigate those areas, and that's going to answer the questions and possibly raise more questions. So the assessment really is something that is very fluid. It kind of presents itself over time as you ask and investigate the data. However, in my notes tab here, I'm still identifying the steps that I did in my analysis. So this is really important because I want to be able to demonstrate what I did in my assessment, as well as being able to reproduce it in the future. So I identified the steps that I took for setting up the analysis, and as well as I'm identifying some of the observations. So first, based on the frequency distribution, I see that some of the questions were used more frequently than others, and that it had changed over time. So we are not using a complete set of questions all the time, that those questions had shifted. But I selected the questions that seemed to be the most frequently used, and that's what I'm going to stick with in my analysis. I also noticed that a majority of the survey responses were from online sections, and that the response frequency was heavily weighted towards the strongly agree. So those were the observations. And now some decisions that I'm making towards my, when I conduct my analysis, is that I'm sticking with question 112. That's I learned the subject matter for this course, and that appears to be a good measure of success. And so I want to look at all the different variables that would help us increase that score. And I also look at the term name, and that I saw that question 112 was first asked during the fall of 2014. So that's really where I'm going to start my analysis, is taking a look at the data beginning fall 2014 and moving forward. And I also identified a set of 16 questions that appear to be the most frequent questions, and that they exist from fall 2014 moving forward. So through this assessment, I better understood the data, and I have a good idea of the data that I'm going to be using and the subset of data that I'm going to be using for my analysis. It's certainly identified that I can't use the complete set of data, that there's a certain subset that's going to be relevant to this analysis. So this shows how we can use Excel to conduct our assessment of the data. And this is the assessment that we do before we begin our analysis. We need to do this step first to understand the data and really to develop a plan for how we're going to filter out the data to conduct our analysis.